Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's EfL Send community event, which is on the topic of engagement. Thank you very much for joining us and for being part of today. As we race towards the end of yet another school term, we really do appreciate how busy you all are, especially after what has been another exceptionally challenging 3 months. We're joined in the live meeting by colleagues from across England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Dubai, and even New Zealand. So special shout out and thanks to our Antipodean partners who are clearly burning the midnight oils to be with us at this time. We've been planning this event and creating the accompanying resources for a number of weeks. Actually, it's probably a few months, Barry and Bev, if we think about it. And we're really excited to share these with you and spend the next 2 hours with you. And we look forward to everyone's contribution. A couple of housekeeping points. If I could ask you to keep your microphones muted at all times, that would be helpful. And as I said at the beginning, we are recording the main event. We're not able to record the breakout rooms, and we will be sharing the recording with you all next week. And I'll be talking a bit more about that in a moment. So what are the aims for this meeting? As the title of the meeting suggests, we're going to be doing something of a deep dive into engagement. And in doing so, we'll take very much a multi-dimensional perspective. We hope to give you ideas, resources, discussion points, and perhaps even models for discussion and CPLD that you can take back to your school. Lastly, with the number of colleagues and the diverse range of backgrounds and experience that we have through everybody in this live meeting, and within the EfL community at large, which now numbers more than 500 specialist settings, this should be a fabulous opportunity to network with other practitioners and leaders, whether it's through the breakout rooms that we'll be doing about halfway through today, the Padlet, or the plenary when we'll be opening up the floor and sharing our group reflections. Now, we've been doing a lot of thinking and talking with colleagues recently, I say recently, really over the last 6 months, about these last two bullets, these last two goals. And before we move on to the main event, I'd like to share with you some new ideas and models that we're effectively launching today that we hope will assist you with the CPLD networking and collaboration goals. So we'd like to try and do with this event and with many of the other events going forward is look to extend and deepen the CPLD opportunity beyond the actual event. I think we've all experienced situations where we attend a CPD meeting or a conference, get fired up with new ideas and knowledge. We perhaps even make some great contacts, and that's wonderful and useful in itself. But the challenge is, how do we translate that into opportunities and benefits for our school? And ultimately, of course, how do we translate that into opportunities and benefits for the children, young people and adults who are our learners? And that's what we want to try and help you with. And we hope that you'll join us. And here's how. Many of you will be aware of the Learning Shared podcast, which we launched in May of last year. As it says on the slide there, the podcast was originally conceived to shine a light on wonderful practice, good ideas, creativity, particularly focusing on vulnerable children, young people and adults, and those with SEND or any form of additional learning needs. We kicked off the podcast last year by producing the first 15 episodes, and they were focused on the recovery curriculum, building on that wonderful think piece that was co-authored by Barry and Matthew Carpenter. What we found was that these podcasts gave us a chance to really explore ideas and practice with a very wide range of colleagues and practitioners. And it was also a great opportunity for us to provide a platform and audience for those colleagues to share their insights. And it really proved to be a popular and effective model. Just to give you an idea, between all podcast and video channels, the 16 episodes that we recorded, it included a special episode that Barry and I recorded for Mental Health Awareness Week last year. The 16 episodes have been streamed, downloaded, listened to, or watched more than 55,000 times. So this is something that we really want to build on. So this week, we're excited to launch what will be the second series of Learning Shared. And this is part of what we mean when we talk about extending the CPLD opportunities beyond the scope of today's meeting. So in preparation for this meeting, we've recorded 3 hour-long episodes of the podcast, which include a lecture presentation from Barry Carpenter and Bev Cockbill. And we have a fantastic, almost 2-hour roundtable discussion involving 6 panelists from a really diverse range of settings, both in specialist and mainstream schools, as well as national bodies. And in addition to these 3 episodes, we're planning at least a further 2 episodes on the topic of engagement. So together with the opportunities available today, we're pulling together for you more than 6 hours of what we hope you'll agree is really high quality CPLD for you and your school. So please do feel free to share these resources wildly and widely. And of course, it's worth saying that all of this is free. So I've listed on this slide the episodes that we've produced so far. Part 1 corresponds with episode 17 of the podcast, and so on. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists who took part in episodes 18 and 19 in particular, along with Barry, Bev, Vijita and Cheryl, who are with us today as co-hosts. We were also joined for part 2 and part 3 of the discussions that you can see on the screen at the moment by Ali Erskine, Martin McKenna, Gemma Aldrit and Vicky Wells. You can find the Learning Shared podcast in audio form via all the usual podcast outlets and channels, including Apple, Google, Spotify. For the video versions, so the versions that have got presentations associated with them or attached to them, for the time being, you'll need to go to the website, either www.learningshared.org or www.evidenceforlearning.net. If you forget or ever in any doubt, just go to the Evidence for Learning website and you'll see there's a link at the top of the page for the Learning Shared podcast. So let's turn now to the second of those bullets, those goals we were talking about. How can we facilitate the networking and collaboration opportunities for you? And this is where we'll look at the Padlet. So I've switched now. After showing you the wrong screen, I'm going to show you hopefully the right screen. So it looks like you've all been beavering away at the Padlet. It's pretty self-explanatory, and I have explained this already. We'll be using this throughout the day. If I can ask you to make a post for your school, and to make a post, just to quickly show you, it's very straightforward. Just hit the plus button, use the title to use for the name of your school, and then where it says write something, if you just click there, there's a schema that you can follow where it tells you a little bit about what you're doing currently around using EfL, what your next steps are, and provide a contact detail. When you finish, you literally just click away. And if you want to change the color of your post, you literally just hover over it and you'll see there's 3 dotted lines. And if you want to pick a color, I'll make this one blue, you can change the color. What we've got over here on the left is a couple of columns here where we'll invite you to either make posts where you maybe want to add your name to a working group. We've had some colleagues have suggested possible future topics for meetings or working groups. And feel free to suggest a working group if there isn't one that's already on there. So that's the Padlet. And what we found in the past is that has already had a fabulous impact in being able to connect people right around the country. And obviously, because we've got people from various parts of the world, it's also been very good for that too. So let me just go back to my PowerPoint 1 second. So these are some of the working groups that we've already established. And in April and May, we're going to be working on one looking at empowering families and effective partnerships. And we're also going to be looking at one that's specifically focused on mental health and well-being. Please do feel free to suggest any other topics that we might consider as well. Right, let's swiftly move on to today's proceedings. So what you really need to know about engagement. I would like to start by introducing my co-hosts for today. Professor Barry Carpenter's career in education spans more than 40 years. He's been a classroom teacher, a head teacher at 3 schools. He's been an inspector of schools, as well as the director of the Centre for Special Education at Westminster College in Oxford. In 2009, he was appointed by the DFE as the National Director of the Children with Complex Learning Difficulties and Disabilities Research Project. And In that role, Barry led an important and valuable piece of research on the use of engagement as a pedagogy. And this work obviously became the foundation for the Department for Education's new guidance for assessment that came out of the Rochford Review, and what has been adapted and set to become statutory summative assessment in England from 2021. Vijita Patel is the principal at Swiss Cottage School Development and Research Centre. That's a special needs school for children aged 2 to 19 in London. Vijita wears many hats. As a national leader in education, she supports head teachers, senior and middle leaders, as well as SENCOs and local authority teams on leading locality and provision developments. She's contributed to the development of programs for teacher training and leadership development. And Swiss Cottage School is one of 8 schools in the country to have had 6 consecutive outstanding Ofsted inspections. Cheryl Gaughan is the assistant head at Talbot Specialist School. She's also the head of Fusion Teaching School Alliance and has a role as the citywide SENCO for SEND across the city and local authority of Sheffield. Cheryl has been heavily involved in the rollout of the engagement training recently. Alex Revens is the SEN lead practitioner for an SLD specialist provision at Belmont School in Harrow. He's also an SLE for autism. And Alex recently authored a paper entitled Using the Engagement Model to Assess and Capture Engagement in Children with Severe Learning Difficulties within a Mainstream Additionally Resource Provision. More importantly, Alex has also just become a father for the first time on Monday evening, a beautiful baby girl. So he probably hasn't slept since the weekend and is exhausted. So thank you very much, Alex, for still being with us today, and congratulations again. Just incidentally as well, we'll be sharing a copy of Alex's paper as part of the resource pack for this event. Finally, Bev Cockbill is a complex learning needs coordinator and specialist teacher for Chadsgrove School Support Services on the Communication Complex Needs team. Bev's worked for SSAT as a training coordinator for the complex learning needs and as a research and development assistant on the DFE-funded CLDD research project. Bev was a key protagonist on Barry's team in the development and research work that was done on engagement. So I'm going to shortly invite Barry and Vijita and Cheryl to give our keynote presentation. Alex will then share his lightning talk with us, which showcases how he's using evidence for learning to build a rich, vivid picture, as well as develop conversations around engagement. We'll then pause and take some questions for our panel. So on that, if I could ask you, if you do have any questions for the panel, if you could use the chat box to pose those, we'll try and pull everybody together for a quick Q&A session before we break out into the rooms. Barry has to leave us at that point. He's been asked to attend a meeting with the Minister for Children and Families. So, as I say, that's when we'll turn proceedings over to you and we'll move to the breakout rooms. During the breakout rooms, we're going to discuss 2 questions for hopefully around 25 minutes, and then we'll come back together, share some of the salient reflections from those various discussions, so that hopefully we'll end up with a real treasure trove of useful and thought-provoking ideas and discussion points for you to take away and share with your school. On that note, I'd like to invite Barry, Vijita and Cheryl to give us their keynote presentation for today's session.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be with you, and really want to begin by thanking Alan for the time and the energy he has put into this. This is kind of integral in some ways to evidence for learning, but it's also at times bolt on, and Alan just never fails to be supportive in helping us all to achieve things that we want to achieve for our children and for me, for our profession. For a time, Bev and I have wanted to make this podcast, and it took us 2 months actually to design this and bat it backwards and forwards. I think we were guilty of knowing too much, and it needed to be refined and to be able to speak to you. I want to be very clear about its purpose. Its purpose is very much to complement what I welcome as the very exciting development of statutory summative assessment, of engagement from September 2021 as statutory summative assessment. And some of you have had that training, or people like Cheryl have been delivering that training. But engagement did not start in 2016 as a recommendation from the Watchwood Review. It had a life before that. It had a very vivid life in this country that was directly rooted in our children, in our schools, and the needs of both our profession and for the learning of our children. So the point of this is to give you a complete picture of the journey of engagement from its international research base, from the evidence base through systematic inquiry in our schools, in our country, with our children, and for colleagues from the other countries of the United Kingdom. Yes, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland all had children involved, and for our colleagues in New Zealand, as Jane Thistlethwaite knows only too well, we had schools in New Zealand, Australia, USA, Ireland involved in the trialling of this. So it was tested within an inch of its life. Would this embrace the learning needs of 21st century children with complex needs, this new generation of children? And that is why the P levels had to go. They were 20th century assessment based on what we knew about children in the 20th century. And in this 21st century, we've seen a rapidity and evolution in varying learning difficulties and disabilities like we have never seen before. I could talk about that all day, but prematurity, FASD, rare syndromes, they're coming through thick and fast constantly. And so we needed, when we were doing the Complex Needs Project, we not only had to identify who were these children, what were their needs, but then, I'm a teacher. I've remained a teacher throughout my career, whatever title I have held. Always for me, the question is, okay, that's their diagnosis. I'm not a diagnostician. I'm not a medical doctor. How do I teach? How do they learn? Tell me how they learn, how that brain functions, and then I will, if I don't know how to teach, I will evolve the ways to teach. So we want to share with you about engagement as pedagogy and engagement for formative assessment and how that's led to engagement as summative assessment. If you only have a training diet of engagement as summative assessment, it's frankly going to be just dull and boring, and you're not going to get the richness of the engagement process. And your children are not going to get the deep meaning of engagement for learning. As Alan said, this is going to be the first in 3 podcasts. The other 2 are going to involve the panel discussing what was the impact of the slides that you'll have in the podcast. Which one would they choose as having the impact on them? And Vijita and Cheryl this afternoon are particularly just going to show you what we mean and give you a flavour of that second podcast. And the third podcast, each of the panel members talked about innovation around engagement that they were currently involved in. So this will be the format of this podcast mini-series, but we're hoping to design others, always looking to illuminate an aspect of practice, to then put it through some scrutiny, and then to take it to a level of ongoing inquiry. Yes, we are an evidence-based profession, but we need to be inquiry-focused. We don't know all the answers. I'm about to retire in July, and for me, this is a legacy piece. It's a parting gift. And for me, I'm retiring having more questions than when I started this profession. And the only way you'll ever get any answers is to inquire for and with the children. Ultimately, they will give you the answers to what their learning needs are if you have the eyes to see it and the ears to hear it. So let me give you a sample this afternoon of what will be in the longer podcast that Alan is making available to you all and more widely from tomorrow. So this slide was chosen by Gemma Aldrich. Gemma is new to our group. Gemma actually comes from a secondary school, so a secondary mainstream school. And she has seen in her children these things, that they are returning disruptive, they're very disorientated, disengaged. Oh my goodness. We have rafts of children coming back to all of our school settings who are disengaged. Teachers are saying, oh, the children have bounced back in. They're really joyful. And then a few days in, they're finding that that was a mask. They're camouflaging their true feelings. They are frail, fragile, and fragmented. They are frail in their self-efficacy, to use a quote from Laura Purser, who I know is listening into this afternoon. Their self-belief, their self-concept as a learner has been damaged by these lockdown periods. They're fragile as learners. Their learning pathways have been in a state of what Minded, in its latest definition of adverse childhood experiences, would define as fight, flight, and freeze. So just imagine some of those neural pathways in the brain, some of those learning pathways have been frozen. We need to unfreeze them. And there are ways of doing that, and there are other lectures I've recorded that will illuminate that. And you've got children coming back with fragments of learning. Maybe they've done absolutely everything that you asked them to do at home, but it's not interconnected. It's a pile of jigsaw pieces. And we need to connect that, because it didn't happen in the socially vibrant, dynamic classroom where you would have gone about building that coherence and cohesion to their learning. Gemma had chosen this one from a secondary perspective is because those words have caused the secondary school to use engagement as intervention. So they're not saying they are going to universally use it across the whole school, but where children are showing high levels of disengagement, then Gemma has trained the learning mentor team to use engagement to baseline. Instead of giving that child who's now failing in English and maths, literacy and numeracy, more literacy and numeracy, they're stepping back and saying, in what way is this child engaging or not engaging in English and maths? So they're using the 5 areas, what I would call 5 lenses, really. They're taking those 5 areas as lenses and are trying to sharply focus on the learning pathways of persistence, etc., that the child may or may not be showing. So that's one contribution from a secondary context that's actually trying to unravel what I'm calling in this pandemic period compounded complexity. You've known complex needs, you have children with complex needs, but oh my goodness, this pandemic and the experiences of lockdown in this pandemic have caused that complexity to be compounded. This next slide was chosen by Ali Erskine, who is head of school at Whitfield Aspen School, which is in Dover and is an inclusive primary and special school, totally combined as one school. A very successful school, and she'd chosen this because she felt it represented that group of children and where they are located, which is an area of social deprivation. And it's about the vulnerability that the children are showing, that their backgrounds are often disadvantaged. They may be living in situations of deprivation and showing a disability. Take, for example, the child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Already the Lancet, the medical journal, has, in the pandemic period, put out warnings, and I saw some come through some recent literature from New Zealand and Australia too, that alcohol levels, alcohol consumption during the pandemic period has risen. We know that from supermarket sales. Lancet is saying to the medical profession, be aware that you will be getting a lot more births of children who are prenatally exposed to alcohol. So for the child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, they've had a disadvantage, a toxic pregnancy, stormed with alcohol. Then they are born to a mother who is by then alcoholic, and they are removed very early on in their life from that biological mother, and they go into the care system. Bernardo's have reported a 44% increase in children in care during this pandemic period. And so that is not the sort of sustained nurturing environment we'd expect to put our babies into. And ultimately, they get this diagnosis of a disability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, now the largest non-genetic cause of learning disability in the UK, running at 2.9% of our child population. Statistically, although probably not in reality, statistically that is higher than children with autism in our system. So that was Ali's choice. And I would follow that on by saying, well, vulnerable children, how does that affect the child as a learner? Well, they are fragile learners, echoing what I said earlier. Those neural pathways are not robust to carry a catch-up type curriculum. We need to emotionally regulate to educate. We need to think about the pitch and pace of our lessons. Our children have suffered much during this pandemic. Now is the time to reimagine how we serve their needs, to renegotiate the social contract with our children, but also to renegotiate the learning contract with our children. A spiky profile might look something like this, the image I tried to give you earlier. And this is one that Bev designed with all those jigsaw pieces in it. Yep, they're coming back with everything you've taught them, but those jigsaw pieces are not interlocked. More than ever, you're going to see this spiky profile of learning. Some of you know, and you've heard me say, from the very early days of trying to define complex needs, I wanted to put in for the DFE statutory definition the word spiky profile, and I was told by some senior civil servant that Professor Carpenter, the word spiky was really not a word the department could endorse. Well, tough. I actually think this describes what you'll be seeing in your children. In some areas, you will be seeing what you expected, perhaps in their communication skills. In other areas, particularly their well-being, I would guess, you will be seeing children who are very insecure and emotionally quite bereft. This next slide, and the quote that you will see there, was actually chosen by Vicky Wells. Vicky Wells is a national manager for targeted interventions with the Youth Sports Trust. How fabulous to have now a national organisation within our community of evidence for learning. And Vicky spoke as to why this slide in the engagement podcast spoke to her, this idea of the young person connecting with their environment, with people, ideas, materials, concepts. And actually, when you think about it, our children have been deprived significantly in this last 12 months of some of those contacts and some of those connections. We're only talking in a meeting this morning that, in fact, we're not at the point of recovery in terms of a recovery curriculum, because you only recover once you're over the illness, and this pandemic has not gone away yet. At the moment, we're in the process of rebuilding our school communities. We are rejoining, children are rejoining their friendship groups, are reconnecting with the wider school community, and relationships are very much at the heart of that process. Can I commend to you some of Vicky's work on sports sanctuaries that you will find, the piece she's written, you'll find posted on my website. And I'm delighted to be able to share with you that on the 19th of April, the Youth Sports Trust will be launching a national scheme called Active Recovery. It involves 40 sports organisations across the country and will give children the chance to build what Ofsted observed in their report on their 900 visits to our schools last term, where they saw children who had lost a lot of physical fitness, stamina, high levels of mental distress, and regression. And this will be a free programme, and they have modelled active recovery on the 5 levers of recovery that Matthew and I wrote in the recovery curriculum document. I know that Vicky is going to be talking to Alan about the wider use of the Evidence for Learning app for recording and reporting attainment and achievement in physical education and sport. So it's about sustainable learning. Engagement is about sustainable learning. This next one is, I think, key to where we find ourselves at the moment, because if you believe in engagement, you have to believe in its antithesis, which is to be disengaged. And so our quest, our mission, our journey has to be to re-engage the child. And that may involve a range of interventions. This intervention, for example, might be your regular maths lesson. But instead of teaching 45 minutes of maths numeracy, you might teach 15 minutes and then have a 5-minute mindfulness, or for some of our children, maybe 5 minutes with their happiness box. And then another 10 to 15 minutes of maths, and then an on-the-spot physical activity that involves imitation. Imitation, remember, Piaget said, is the foundation of all learning. And I finished a research project just before lockdown kicked in, which showed that activities that have an imitation component cause new neural pathways to grow in the brain. So go back to what I said earlier. If the neural pathways, the learning pathways that your children had before the lockdowns have now experienced fear and freeze, as that minded definition describes, fear and freeze, they'll be sluggish in their operation. Teach something new that involves imitation, a new sport, maybe that involves using a racket in a particular way or throwing a ball, something that demands new skill acquisition, therefore new neural pathway growth. And that new neural pathway growth will kickstart and encourage better functioning in other areas of the brain that are sluggish. Colleagues, that's low cost, no cost. Yes, I'm calling for a universal revival of Simon Said. We all need 5-minute fill-ins unless you're telling me we've become a perfect profession. This intervention might be that you've got children in your school who have lost grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbours in this pandemic. And maybe you decide to hold a bereavement group on a weekly basis. This may be a social skills group because some of your children with autism have lost the skills and no longer recognise the routines for social interaction that they were using successfully before. This may be a well-being group for those children that are sitting in your classroom rigid with fear and are not learning because their brains are being stormed by cortisol. It's blocking the memory imprint, and the anxious child is not a learning child. Now, this next slide was chosen by Vijita Patel. So, Vijita, over to you if you would like to speak to this slide.
Good afternoon, Barry, and good afternoon, colleagues. A pleasure to be here today. And I must start by saying the 1-hour podcast that's been created by Professor Barry Carpenter really was nourishment for us as a leadership team when we thought about the journey we've been on with the pandemic itself. For this slide, the reason that it certainly resonated for me in particular is because of the way it brings us back to that bigger picture on school improvement. So the slide, as you can see, says without engagement, there is no deep learning, there is no effective teaching, there is no meaningful outcome, there is no real attainment, and without engagement, there is no quality progress. So at the heart of this, for me, was certainly considerations around provision design and that bigger sort of consideration around school improvement. For international colleagues, just to share that our system is certainly shaped by an accountability system here in the UK. But I think internationally and universally, the backdrop really for pupil progress is a very linear model. The focus from Barry and other system leaders has been very relentless to break that linear model and really put the right components into place so that those of us certainly in England can feel the developments through the assessment without levels and the engagement profiles through the Rochford review. What it's crucially giving to us as school leaders and to schools in general is a lever to ensure that holistic needs of our pupils shapes the principles for our curriculum, and that is driving the assessment measures. And an incredible golden thread, in my opinion, is the role of engagement. This component of your podcast, Barry, for me was pivotal because not only is that linear model within the system for pupil progress, but I feel it is equally felt for staff, whether that's through career progression, whether that has to do with professional development. There are some archaic sort of realities that sit in the system that mean that actually what resonated for me was your message on exploring engagement in the broadest sense. And when we think about that broadest sense, we are then thinking about that bigger picture for our school. We have tried to mobilize the scope of engagement into what we now think of as our ecosystem, that is Swiss Cottage School, and every school does an incredible job of making that sort of culture and ethos for learning really special, not just for the pupils and families, but really for our teams and our staff that work so hard. Fundamentally, for me, certainly was the potential that we can see, because the 5 areas of engagement are not a hierarchy. And so there's such scope for how they're utilized in terms of school improvement. What lies here for us as a community of teachers, practitioners, and school leaders is the priceless scope for systematic school improvement. So the 5 areas brought us an opportunity to scaffold the key components across our school. When we think about our 5 curriculum pathways, we are a complex needs, special needs school. How Barry described at the beginning, the reality that we're constantly learning about approaches to pedagogy for our children and young people, the systems and processes that we have in place to capture those reflections of planning, the journey of learning for the pupils, and what is reflected in their progress picture. For me, this slide and this moment in the podcast was really pivotal because what it brought me back to was that broader consideration on how engagement is such a useful tool on the assessment side, certainly. Fundamentally, the assessment piece and that pupil perspective for engagement, utilizing the 5 areas is going to be profound and really shape the system. But alongside that is our conscious consideration for our teachers and our practitioners in our school community. So at the center of this system is this construct that really there's a slightly judgmental evaluation with criteria that evaluates practice. Is it good? Is it outstanding? And what we've recognized is that the engagement profile, it's a fantastic scaffold when we think about lesson observations, learning walks, moderation of data, moderation of planning, peer-to-peer observations. The engagement profile, really those scaffolds allows us shifts with the process to one that gives ownership to teachers and practitioners. So it certainly allowed us to move our processes from that very crude performance of teaching to reflections on the process of learning. Our entire observation process, all of that paperwork that can sort of sit and wrap around it, actually has been completely changed. We no longer grade lessons. What we're doing is we're using the engagement ladder and the 5 areas of the engagement profile so that the conversation around that observation is thinking about that process of learning for a group of pupils that the teacher is focusing on. And then it allows the teacher to reflect on that with their teaching assistants as well after the learning observation coaching conversation. When we shifted that in our school, we built in a culture of reflective inquiry, one that is active and owned by the teachers, by the practitioners, and the teaching assistants. So actually what it's doing is it's leading to a deeper knowledge and expertise around pedagogy and learning design, but one that isn't just down to the qualified teacher, who can often have a range of qualifications that place them in that key position. Actually, what it's doing, it is sharing that reflection around learning design with all of the adults that are wrapped around this journey of learning for these pupils. And what we find really fantastic is that that ongoing professional dialogue as peers is one that is really valued and desired because they have total ownership of that. Suddenly, what we feel is that we're shifting the archaic models that sit in schools for school improvement. So I am also sort of a victim of often saying, well, that's how we've always done this. But what it's allowed us to do is actually to think, you know, we've got this great opportunity through the 5 areas of the engagement model. For us, we actually originally built it around the 7. And what's come through that is the opportunity for a far more dynamic and meaningful model that gives space for those key reflections on the factors during learning that lead to quality progress. So the formative and summative assessment piece is there, but also it's allowing us to really think about what are the ingredients that have led to that environment and moment being exactly what it needed to be to unlock that potential in learning. So when we think about engagement in the broadest sense, we can feel a greater role for it with school improvement. At the heart is absolutely a crucial impact, as Barry described at the beginning, on really contextualized formative assessment. And I still hold on to how exciting that feels, knowing what the system may have been like prior to this opportunity. What's equally exciting is the role that it plays to ensure teaching assistants and practitioners are a part of that reflective discussion. Their understanding of the 5 areas of engagement means they're not simply recipients of criteria or recipients of targets that they implement. Actually, they have a really meaningful voice through how they have observed that journey of learning for the pupil in that potential activity with the scaffolds of the 5 areas. Moving this beyond that to also empower teachers to reflect on their classroom practice through the engagement lens, for us has meant that we're placing them at the heart of provision design. It's allowed us basically to change the school improvement model so that it's no longer top down. Actually, instead, I think what's fantastic is that construct has sort of been shattered, because our best provision developments have come from ideas and sort of burning questions that are from classroom level. And a lot of those are not the outcome solely of data analysis or priorities that are coming through the system, but actually what's been observed by teachers through the 5 and 7 areas of the engagement profiles because of the scaffolds that has. And it's been really exciting to see. That will certainly strengthen the deep learning for pupils. So when we think about those 5 bullet points on the screen, we can think about all of that in terms of our children and young people, but I quite strongly feel at this point of the podcast, it really resonated for me because it was about equally the teachers, the practitioners, the teaching systems themselves, and how the 5 areas of the engagement profile can mobilize their ownership over that reflective discussion. They invest so much in the relationships with pupils and their parents, their carers, their families. So their confidence in the 5 areas of the engagement profile equips them in those conversations with families when there is a desire to problem solve a priority or potentially explore how we might be able to generalize some learning and some skill to maximize that progress picture. For the pupils themselves, I feel what's really powerful in this consideration as well at this point of the podcast is that sense of the broader sort of considerations with the engagement profiles. For a child or young person, either independently or with the support of the adults wrapped around them, to be able to not have to focus on the deficit, which might be a gap in learning, but actually for that conversation to shift to for example, what can I or we start to think about how to persevere with something that's coming through as a challenge? Because if we're exploring that component of it, actually the development that will come through is going to be that much more deeper. So as a leader in a special school, the key thing I would say to colleagues that have joined is actually how I feel this resonates not just for our school, but for any mainstream school that could be wanting to explore how to empower the pupils and the staff themselves. Certainly with this podcast and this slide, Barry, you have supported our reflections to have conviction on the scope of engagement in its broadest sense. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijita. Thank you for those insights, particularly. This next slide was chosen by Cheryl Gaughan. And interesting that Cheryl chose this mainstream profile, which is based on the work of my dear friend and wonderful colleague, Bev Cockbill, who has constructed this podcast with me. And this is from some of Bev's work, which now as a complex needs coordinator is very much working with the disengaged child. And Bev's been doing that for a few years now and has got a wealth of knowledge that at this point in time, when lots of us are going to be encountering higher levels of disengagement with children returning to schools, will give us some fantastic insight. So, Cheryl, do you want to make a few comments on this?
Yep, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be with you, and thank you to Barry, Alan and Bev for inviting me. I feel very privileged. I think the reason why this slide really resonated with myself was that I have the privilege to offer some support from a specialist setting coming from Talbot Specialist School, and offer that support to mainstream settings in my role as a citywide SENCO. And I understand how the engagement model and its principles can be really applied to our mainstream classrooms as well. So when I'm working in a mainstream school, or when I'm working with colleagues in mainstream schools, I always start by explaining to them what the 5 areas of engagement actually are, and why, like Vijita has alluded to, why it is so important to baseline. I think that we need to acknowledge at this point that there are a lot of children with SEND who have happily returned to school, but there are some children who are returning to school with areas of their learning that colleagues are just finding really difficult to identify. And it's these children who have previously not presented with additional needs, and it's this that we need where the support of the engagement model really, really comes into play. So just referring to Barry, he refers frequently to the pandemic that's leading our children to be disengaged with school, disengaged with their friends and their family, etc. And it's about re-engaging our children in their self-worth, believing in themselves, finding out what really motivates them, and then using this to then re-engage in their learning. And this is why I feel that baselining is so important. We can use those 5 areas to observe and record activities that show that child fully engaged, enjoying the activities and being immersed in what they are doing and what they love. And this is why we really need to capture this and then learn from it. And knowing what motivates a child to re-engage in their learning is the very backbone to our teaching, to our planning, and to our learning. And all that then consolidated to our curriculum. And as teachers, we want to make sure that we include opportunities and activities in all of our lessons so that that child will engage, but engage meaningfully with purpose. And I think that's something that I really need to hammer home. It's so important to me. And it goes without saying that we also need to know our children that we're working with so well, extremely well, to ensure that that successful engagement is actually taking place. And in all schools, it's about understanding who the right person is to carry out that observation. And as Vijita alluded to, it was also about knowing them as a person and also knowing who knows them best and actually working together and being able to provide and capture those observations together and working together to make sure that we're providing that best provision possible. And then using this knowledge and to weave it into that planning and that personalisation of their learning and the curriculum. And we refer to that pedagogy of that triangle of that differentiation, that personalisation and the engagement, those 3 sides, and how they all need to blend together as one to ensure that our children are active participants in their education and they're driving us forward. The more time that we spend observing a child and gathering that that evidence of how they are engaging, and we then deepen our understanding of why and how and what motivates them in a variety of situations, it's then possible to then feed this into the development of the curriculum and making sure that it's actually right for them. And I think in a mainstream setting, this part is really, really important. And I suppose in a mainstream setting, this is really for those children that have those more complex needs and are engaging with that informal curriculum. But we really do have to acknowledge that some of our children who are disengaged, the principles behind the 5 areas of engagement can really be applied, as they need to be maybe accessing a more semi-formal curriculum and to help them re-engage and then move to a more formal curriculum, but when the time is actually right for them. Some of our children that I've worked with who are now presenting with additional needs, I've used the engagement model profile with colleagues in order to try and capture how they engage with their learning now by providing a variety of experiences and stimulus, and by looking at what engages and motivates them, but also what disengages them as well, and why. And I think that is so important to acknowledge, that we need to understand disengagement just as much as engagement. And by doing this, we've been able to identify those different ways of teaching, those interventions to support particular areas of need, and particularly around that self-confidence, those anxiety levels, how to reduce them, and those social and emotional support. What do we need to put in place for that child to feel comfortable in their learning, to be able to re-engage with them, with school, and enjoy their learning, and have a positive impact on their mental health, both in school and also outside school as a family. And when I first say this to colleagues in mainstream schools, they always say to me, right, actually, Cheryl, it's all the time it's going to take, it's the staffing and the workload. And I think probably COVID is probably making this particularly hard at the moment with the whole bubble situation. But there is still definitely a way, because there's a will. Okay. Personally, using the EfL app, does this, and it helps with the workload and tracking, presenting that progress to reduce that workload. It's an amazing tool for that. And I've worked with staff to show them that the observations using the engagement profile really doesn't have to take that long. And to be honest, with the staff staying in bubbles, you really get to know those children really well anyway, in a variety of those situations that you may not have found yourself in with them before. So, for example, staff are staying in classroom for lunch times, and sometimes it's really difficult for our young people to stay in class and or to go into the dining room and cope with those loud noises. And you see them engaging in conversations that they wouldn't necessarily engage in a bigger dining room. You have more time for those one-to-one conversations, and those people, those staff that are engaging in those one-to-one interventions, they have to do it themselves because the other staff can't cross bubbles. So it's really important to acknowledge that is some sort of positive coming out of that. And the engagement model and its principles provide that flexibility and those opportunities to reflect as practitioners. And with the Ofsted framework in mind, and we've taken into that consideration of the teachers and TA's workload and looking after our own mental health and well-being, using the app to capture that progress, it really does save time. And what I can say is that, and what I found personally was one of our innovations, was using the app and having an electronic device to record it. It's so much easier to keep track than when I first started, and I had big A3 pieces of paper on my walls with loads of post-it notes. And I used to have children that used to love flapping. So they'd rip them off the wall and they'd flap, or I'd lose post-it notes because they'd eaten, or I'd just lose them somewhere in my classroom. So it's been by being able to share these experiences with my mainstream colleagues, how specialist schools, how we track those really small steps in progress. And it allows them to breathe easy, to be quite honest, because as soon as I say that, I go, right, I can help you. Because we've been there, we've done that, we've got the T-shirt, and we've got the skills to be able to say, this is how we do it. Please share in those experiences.
Great.
And that's it.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's brilliant. I love your bit about you need to understand disengagement as much as we need to understand engagement. Thank you. So moving on, this is actually the slide that I would choose to share with you this afternoon. Indeed, I have. Because we hear lots of equating P scales P1 to 4 to the new engagement model. That is only a component of it. If it's the only group of children we try and use it with, then we're disadvantaging huge groups of other children in our system who could benefit from this. The other phrase that Rochford brought out, and I think is absolutely key, is pupils not engaged in subject-specific learning. You could probably name a lot of those before the pandemic lockdowns. I'm sure now your schools are full of them. And this is a group of children who will benefit so much from the engagement approach if we use it flexibly and creatively. And that broader group of children with complex learning difficulties and disabilities, that is who this has been designed for, because the whole concept of engagement as pedagogy was a response to that evidence that we collected, and Bev and I with other colleagues wrote about in the 2015 book on engaging learners with complex needs. That's who this is for particularly. And that doesn't mean students who have intellectual disabilities. You can have a complex need without having an intellectual disability. A child with cerebral palsy, for example, with very high intelligence, who has epilepsy too, has complex needs. And yes, ultimately we will include those learners with PMLD, because this shines spotlights into those crevices, those nuances of learning behaviour, and teases out attainment and achievement for those children and young people. This is the slide that was chosen by Martin McKenna, the head teacher at Foxfield School. Some of you will have heard Martin speak. The curriculum is the servant of the child, not its master. And more than ever at this point, we need a responsive, dynamic curriculum. This is wrapping around children. That's what I love about evidence for learning as a tool. It enables you to wrap around the child, to capture their experience of learning. As Dylan Williams says, the curriculum should be about the lived experience of the child. Oh my goodness, our children are living through experiences that we could never have conceived prior to this pandemic. And we need to be there for them in that moment, not in some politically driven curriculum. Now is the time to truly serve our children responsibly and creatively. So as Cheryl has just said, to underscore that, this is about 21st century pedagogy and therefore 21st century assessment. Taking the legislated principles of differentiation from the Education Reform Act, from personalisation in the Code of Practice 2015, through to engagement, which we've had as a concept and a construct, but now with this new legislation will be statutory also. We have, imagine that triangle, we have these at each point of that triangle. These are the pulsating dynamics of teaching, learning, curriculum development, and its assessment in our schools and in our classrooms. So it's down to you, as the skilled, intuitive teacher, to lift that mask of fear from our children, to take that child from that position of disenfranchisement from the curriculum and the school itself. You can engage the child as a learner once more. For engagement is the liberation of intrinsic motivation, and that intrinsic motivation lurks in each and every child. I've never met a child in my whole career that I could not, with good teaching, liberate. I want to end with these words from Amanda Gorman, who you remember read a poem at the induction of President Biden. And I think they speak powerfully to us as teachers of the children at this point in time. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover, for there is always a light. If only we are brave enough to see it. If only we are brave enough to be it. Thank you, colleagues. It's my very great pleasure this afternoon to launch these podcasts and to give you these legacy pieces that I hope will enrich your teaching and certainly enrich the learning of your children as you engage them. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Vijita and Cheryl, for a fantastic kickoff presentation. I get lots of virtual applause, so thank you. Alex, would you like to share your screen and take the mic?
See if this works. Okay. Can I just check that's okay? That's working.
Yep.
Yes.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, firstly, just a huge thank you to Alan and to Barry for including me in today's session. I mean, it's an absolute honour for me to be alongside all these colleagues who I'm hearing speak, who I really look up to in the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for involving me today. And I'm going to talk a bit today about how we've been working at Belmont School on using evidence for learning to develop that conversation around engagement. And the paper that I've written, which Alan's very kindly said that he will share with people, will add detail to that about how we've looked at the engagement model and how it works for our pupils in our unique setting. So a quick bit about our setting is we're a three-form entry mainstream school in North London, and we have an additional resource provision for children with SLD, and we've got 12 children with an EHCP with a wide range of needs, and these children access their mainstream provision alongside the additionally resource provision. What we've seen that's been really interesting in our school and definitely reflects Barry's work is the change in the needs of children we're seeing both within our provision and within our mainstream setting. has changed dramatically since we've introduced the provision and this curriculum at our school. We're seeing children with a much more wider range of needs and more complex needs, and children who we would have seen within specialist settings are making their way into our mainstream schools. And because of that, we've had to really think about these non-subject specific learners and how can we provide the appropriate provision for those children. And that's where the engagement scale and the engagement model has come in and really supported our curriculum and our teaching. So I thought we could just start by going back and just having a look at where we started, really, which this was a year ago, and looking at what our comments and our observations looked like back then. And really, when we looked back and reflected on the work that we were doing, how much are we missing in this observation? How many different areas of that child's engagement, that child's involvement, and more importantly, what their next steps were we not considering? And that's not to say that what we were doing back then was in any way wrong. It was just a different way of looking at things. And we looked back at these and we thought, we've got to think about how are we going to adapt our observations, how we look and how we reflect on the children's engagement in the learning, and make our next steps and our reflections meaningful for our children and for our learners. And that's what brought us through to the engagement scale and model. And thinking about those observations that were capturing what the child was learning, but failing to show us how they were participating. We were writing our next steps at the tip exercise. It was there in our comment template, so our staff knew that they had to write a next step in, but that next step didn't necessarily then lead to change. So we had to think about how could we develop the child's engagement in the learning, and then how could we know that we were successful in that? And then we have this really powerful system within Evidence for Learning to show and capture that story of every single child. How could we incorporate our looking at engagement and our reflective practice within the EfL system? And this led to us introducing this language of engagement. And this was before we thought about the engagement model. This was just looking at Barry's work on the engagement scale, looking at the 7 aspects of engagement before then moving forward to the 5 aspects. And what we did is we changed the way we observed. Firstly, our observations were longer. We used video cameras within our classrooms, and our classroom activities would be observed for the whole entirety of the sessions. We'd look at a wide angle lens, whole picture for every single child. We had more focus specifically on engagement that looked like in each child's learning. Each video was rewatched by the whole team, which created a reflective process for the team. And Cheryl said before, the support staff, the importance of them, and Vijita said, the support staff had a huge impact here, where they could get involved and they really knew our children incredibly well. And this was where we introduced that language of engagement and embedded that into our observations before we looked at implementing the engagement model. And through this document, which I created for our team, we looked at creating a consistency within our observations. So we looked at, firstly, a lot of our observations looked very different from different individuals, and it was good to have a whole picture that looked consistent and consistent. And in here, we included our 5 aspects of engagement. We looked to our staff to start using this vocabulary within what they were doing, within their reflections on what they've seen in our classrooms and within our activities. We looked at the engagement scale from no focus to fully engaged to think about how engaged that child was in the activity, not their end product. And this then led to our engagement pilot, which is what I've written my paper about. Within our engagement pilot, we looked at the incoming assessment using the engagement model, and we thought, what would this look like in our setting? Every setting is completely unique, and our complex needs of children are all completely different. We wanted to make it meaningful for us. We also wanted to make sure that our engagement data did not become a set of numbers. How could we make it meaningful? How could we make it lead to change and lead to progress in our children? How could it lead to a reflective opportunity for staff to implement that change? It was about that change in mindset. Engagement, we needed to see as a facilitator of change and personalisation, not as a way of capturing progress through numbers. And this led to our capturing progress process for our pilot study. And we did a 4-week study within our provision, focused on 5 children specifically who are our non-subject specific learners, who would have come under the criteria for meeting that would be met in September when we have to do this in a statutory way. We use the indicators on evidence for learning to capture engagement across the aspects, and we looked at how our changes and how our adaptations responded to our children's needs and their engagement, and how that developed their engagement as we went forward. As in Barry's work, we used a baseline recording in our first week, but our baseline recording looked at our group session with no intervention in place. We wanted to see how our children would respond to an intervention, and our intervention was based on an attention autism style intervention, based on joint attention as a group, and we wanted to see how our changes and how our reflections would have an impact on our practice for our learners. We replicated the activity at the same time each week, and we put those changes into practice. Those next steps were no longer writing on a page. They were no longer just captured in an observation, never to be seen again. They were used, reflected on, and then implemented. And our activity had to include something that motivated all of our children. We need to look at our motivators as the primary start point for looking at our engagement, and we used water, a huge motivator for all of our children in our group. And what we found was a significant change in the way that we looked at engagement and the way that we looked at our pupils' learning. Each session we watched back in detail for every child. So we would watch each session back or 5 times, once looking at every single child and all of their different behaviours that we would observe. These longer video recordings, each session was about 10 to 15 minutes, created amazing opportunities for us to reflect on how each child engaged with different points in the session and how our practice directly led to their engagement or to their disengagement. It helped us pick up on those behaviours and those engagement behaviours that we had never initially seen. There was one example with one child who immediately disengaged once I said that I had one more time to pour the water. We noticed as we looked back that that child disengaged about 30 seconds after I'd said that. We implemented a change where we didn't give that warning, and we saw a dramatic change in that child's engagement in that aspect of the session. This led to these daily opportunities for these reflective thinking for the whole team. And those reflections were written on EfL through the indicators tool as shown at the side of this slide. We could then refer back to them and look at the future adaptations as we implemented them. This is just a quote here from my paper, which just really looks at what the engagement model has done for us and what that primary aim of assessment is. So it's to deliver a curriculum which is personalised and as relevant as possible to the pupils involved. And the engagement model has encouraged our staff to think more creatively about how to enable these children to access learning. It's for our staff as well as our children, and that's the mindset that we've moved to. And this is just an example of how EfL has helped us here. So the most powerful thing on this slide is the pictures. Looking at our engagement from that first week to our last week, and I'm sure lots of familiar things you can see in there from some of your groups in your classrooms, showing our children who are disengaged and showing how that's changed over time. Using the new spider web tool that Evidence for Learning had added in is a really impactful way of looking at the overall picture of that child's engagement. And whilst, yes, we don't want to use those numbers are secondary. It's good for us as teachers. We like numbers and we like to see progress to show us that we are doing something right. And those numbers helped our staff see that there was really real impact on some of our children as we went forward. And that was reflected in the easy to use output that evidence for learning can provide for us. So we could easily create a profile, an engagement profile for each child, which shows each child's engagement story. And I think that's the most important thing that's developed for us. It's about the story for each child. It's not about the numbers. It's not about how many numbers increased per week. It's not about what how engaged they were in terms of numbers 1 to 5. It's about what can we do to develop experience, to develop that story of engagement for each child. And then that leads to our observations now and change by which we've gone through. We have comments now, which now look at using that terminology of engagement, irregardless whether that child is using the engagement model as their primary mode of assessment. Those key vocabulary are still important in reflecting on the children's learning. As Cheryl said, it's so important for all children, not just for our children who would meet the criteria for the engagement model to be used for. We've also incorporated the aspects and levels of engagement into our tag system so that it's really easy for us to look at that whole journey of engagement that that child has gone on. Our next steps are linked to engagement. They're linked to a clear next step, which can be then implemented. Look at how we can use that motivator for that child's learning. And our next steps, as we continue to embed that engagement model, we want to look at how we can develop our reflective practice even further. How we can involve our parents in their child's engagement journey through the parent portal, and how we can capture engagement at home through the tags, remembering that engagement is about that generalization. Are they engaged in the same things at home and at school, and in what ways are they engaged at home? We've seen through the last year the importance of that homeschool communication and that homeschool working together to develop our understanding of that child's engagement profile. And our most important one now, how can we use that engagement model in our mainstream settings, our high needs pupils, even other children as well, our disengaged pupils, as we go forward in September. So I hope that was useful, and please do have a look at the journal if you are interested in learning more about the work that we've done. Thank you, Alan, for the opportunity to talk through what we've done, and I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and congratulations again. And we really appreciate, I'm sure I speak for everybody, we really appreciate you making the time at this very precious time in you and your wife's lives to be with us today to share that presentation. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay. What we're going to do, because of the timing, I'm really keen that we get as much time for discussion as possible. There are a couple of questions, but maybe we'll come back to those at the end. What I'm going to do in a moment is hit the magic button, and it's going to put people into breakout rooms. It looks like there's about 23 breakout rooms. And if I can ask you just to take a note of the questions. These were the questions that were emailed earlier. Question 1 is, how does the lens of engagement help you to identify learning needs in your pupils and students? And then question 2 is, in a new curriculum area such as SEMH, RHSE and RSE, how can evidence for learning help you to observe and monitor children's progress in this area? And what I would ask is, just referring back to the Padlet, if we switch to the Padlet screen, and I've created 3 columns on the end here, and what I would ask you to do is, within your groups, if one person can volunteer as a scribe and just create a post and just jot down any notes and ideas and salient points. What we'll do is we'll break for about, we'll see how we go with it for about 20 minutes. And then we'll come back together and do something of a plenary and pull some of the thoughts together. But because we're going to have quite limited time, I would like to try and bring this to a close at 3:30 as planned. If the scribes can try and capture as much information as possible, then hopefully this will be a source of follow-up for everybody afterwards.
Alan, that was really interesting about, you know, when it comes up with a countdown, and what Alex was saying about the countdown for the little boy, we kind of stopped engaging in any conversation then, because you're kind of watching the screen to see, oh, we're about to get thrown back, or should we go out, and you kind of lose that last 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So from an engagement point of view, that was quite.
It's that fixation, isn't it? On this is the last bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, look, people I think are still going to filter back a little bit. What I'll do, I'm watching the time, and I really would like to certainly bring the main proceedings to a close by 3:30, because it's a busy time and dismissals and everything else. What we'll do is we'll carry on as long as sort of the last person's standing, but certainly if you feel you have to go, or you have to go to meetings or see off children, then please feel free to drop off. What I would like to do at this stage, just while we've got still 120 people on the call, is thank our speakers for today and the presenters. Barry's had to head off, so in his absence, we'll thank him. But I'd also like to thank Vijita and Cheryl and Alex and Bev in advance for assisting with this part, but also for putting together that first episode in the podcast. Thank you to everyone that's been part of today. Hopefully the breakout rooms have been useful. And as I said, the Padlet will be up continually. So if you want to go back to the Padlet to refer to that, or if you want to put down some follow-up reflections, then please do. And I'll be sharing the recording plus any of the other resources from today sometime next week. The podcast will go live from tomorrow, the first episode, that's episode number 17. And then it's episodes 18 and 19, which is the panel discussion in 2 parts. That'll go live just before Easter. What I'd like to do is really go around the rooms, and this is going to be interesting because in some cases, people that I'd earmarked to chair a room ended up dropping off, so somebody else probably chaired it. So what I'll do is I'll go around what I think were the rooms, and if somebody from that room wants to volunteer to share perhaps one reflection. So I guess one reflection to one of the questions. Like I said, if you can fill in some gaps on the Padlet, that should be helpful. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Bev Cockbill, who may follow up on some questions, just so that, again, we can get a little bit of a respondent situation going, maybe develop out some of the ideas. So perhaps if Vijita, would you like to go first? Is that okay?
Absolutely. We had our group was, it was really interesting because there was such a difference in the number of months or years interaction with EfL. So we went into the direction of just kind of creative ideas on how the use of EfL has developed in the different schools. So we did start with how it could be used for engagement and quickly progressed to maximizing the networking opportunity, Ellen. So thank you very much, because we may not have directly answered the question. However, we had a lot of food for thought because a lot of it actually went in the direction of the use of EfL for parent engagement and
excellent.
How the sort of creative solutions that could be there as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, that's, as I said earlier, that's one of the events that we're going to be doing in May. And Vijita, obviously, you're going to be quite instrumental in the planning of that. What I would ask, just while we've got everybody, if there's any schools or colleagues on the call, or you know of anybody that would be interested in being part of putting together what that parent and family engagement session and set of podcasts might look like, then please reach out to me. And sooner rather than later, because I'd like to say, like I said, that'll probably be one of the next ones that we kick off. But thank you, Vijita. Josh, are you still around? Josh Hamblin? I think I saw you somewhere. There you go. Hey, Josh.
Hello, I'm still here.
Are you all right to feedback from your group, please? Thanks.
Yeah, of course I can. So we sort of talked about how the principles of engagement sort of inform teaching and learning, and we found it really interesting to sort of say, you know, how they sort of form the basis of like observations and things like that, and how we sort of map them into evidence for learning using like assessment books and things like that, and how we can actually really use the app to make things really bespoke to ourselves and our schools and our students.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that's good to hear. Bev, feel free to chip in at any point if you've got any commentary to add.
Will do. Yeah.
Right, next on the list I've got down is Carol S from the village school. Carol with a K, if he's still around. Nope. It's going to be fun. Be like bingo. It literally is with the squares. Bev, within your group, did you have anything that you wanted to feedback from your group at all?
Yeah, we looked at the we talked about evidence for learning briefly. I mean, you're the man to really answer some of the questions there. People were asking about how to work out the tags and so on EfL, and the EHCP targets, you know, linking towards those. We moved on to the first question about the lens of engagement, and Adam mentioned that you know, he noticed it helps remove the task completion, so it's about not being teacher led and about the pupil leading, which is absolutely exactly how we want engagement to look, and about stepping back, you know, and doing that quality observations. And I gave the example of the lad with the sponge on the presentation, which people will see, where he's investigating that sponge, and the teacher wanted him to move on and make that mark making, but he wasn't ready, and it was about celebrating that where he was at, basically. Also, Diane, who's an NQT, mentioned that in early years it's helped them understand that everything doesn't have to be on a tabletop. You know, they got messy play in trays on a table, and the engagement sort of informed them, yes, you can put it on the floor, you know, and looking at building small steps. So the other thing we were all quite interested in was Alex. You mentioned a green model, and we were all quite, in one of your presentations, make it green model, and we wondered if...
That's really nothing.
okay.
Make it green on my observation template literally just tells the staff to make the observation green so it goes on the cloud.
Right, okay.
It was something more impactful than that, but what I was finding was that I had lots of lovely observations that I could never see because they were on one iPad, which was locked in the cupboard at school when I was trying to look at it at home.
Right.
So all I tell staff, even if it's not finished, make it green, and then we can work on it on other devices.
Okay.
Wish it was something better than that.
No, that's fine. No, you've explained that. That's great. We were all thinking, oh, there's something out there we haven't investigated yet. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bev. Well, Alex, do you want to share from your group next? Were there any salient points?
Yeah, I mean, we'd had a really interesting conversation about kind of our journeys with EfL. We were all very, very different points. Some of us just starting, some of us having embedded it for a few years now. One of our main kind of thoughts were looking at, firstly, the engagement model, not just for our P1 to 4 children and the impact it can have on staff and pupils, but a lot of the colleagues in my group use MAP at school as well. And it was looking at how the engagement model can work alongside MAP, and how we can kind of look at teacher workload in looking at making links in things that we already have embedded in our schools and the language of engagement. And I think that's a really interesting journey we could look at in how we could incorporate some of the work that we're already doing in our schools and just use that vocabulary of engagement alongside it. So that was really interesting. And we were just looking at the engagement model as well for children who things are not working for that child, regardless of whether they meet the criteria for that engagement model. Looking at if there is a child who whatever curriculum we've got in place for them is not working for, using that engagement model to really delve into what's working and what's not, and what those next steps can be. And it can be a really good way of doing that. So lots of kind of interesting discussion points of where to go forward.
I think what we have to remember there is you mentioned about age and so on, P levels. The engagement model had to sit somewhere, within the pilot phase of the Rochford Review. So they concentrated on Key Stage 1 and 2, but it is across, it is, you know, really versatile and works across all key stages and all you know, disabilities. So it's something to be mindful of. It's not as rigid as what it may come across. So yeah, and it does work very nicely alongside any assessment that you're using. It could be B squared, it could be Roots for Learning. So it breaks down those steps to be able to reach those targets for the assessment that you're using. Thanks, Alan.
Right, thanks, Beth. Thanks. Gemma Stevens, are you still with us? I can see, no, looks like she's dropped off. What I might do is, it could be here all day otherwise. If anybody's got something they'd like to say, maybe if you could raise the hand on your Zoom, then what we can do is I'll look out for the message and we'll invite you to speak. Cheryl, are you still with us? Because hopefully...
I am, yes. I was just...
Yeah, would you like to... Hopefully your group remained intact till the end.
We did. I met some lovely ladies and we had a really good natter. I know that's probably not work, but I was networking. You know what I'm like, Alan. But we had a really good chat. They were different. We were at different levels using EfL. And something that's really something that Fatima said, I think, was that really interested me was using for mental health and for engaging children. So using the actual observations and having a look at how children's mental health fits in with their mood, I suppose, mood of engagement or their level of engagement. So what is it that we can observe around their mental health that shows them clearly engaging or wanting to engage, and what can we notice about around their mental health that shows that disengaging? I'm hoping that was a good summary, Fatima, if you're still there. But that's the one thing that I've tried to put in the Padlet that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, I've also used it, you know, for SEMH. I've got quite a few case studies just focusing on SEMH and not the academic side of things, because it was where the pupil was at, and it really does lend itself to SEMH. Thanks for raising that.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Joe Williams, are you still with us, or Kaylee?
I am still here, Alan, yeah. Sorry.
Hey, Joe, thank you.
Hi. We had a really good discussion also, and schools that are different stages of using both engagement and EfL, I think. And there were two of us at schools that have got quite a large PMLD cohort, and there was quite a lot of expertise in those PMLD you know, areas with regards to engagement. One of, you know, my school, we found it's easier to transfer all of that into EfL, and we're now very grateful that the indicators are there, whereas Kaylee's school, you know, their workload, their staff felt the other way. It was easier to integrate the engagement model into the systems, the paper-based systems that they already had, but EfL was still a feature in all of it. And we had an interesting discussion about how to just the hows and where to go about it all. So how many observations, you know, the scale, how to use the actual scale. And I think, you know, schools that have been using it for a while were sort of sharing that it's not really about the data and the numbers, like Alex said. Some of Alex's data looked, you know, really good, but that's one class. And I think when you start looking at it across a number of classes, you do get, you know, varied way of looking at things, but actually it's just to facilitate that discussion and start using that language about engagement and coming away from that word moderation. So it's not about everybody saying, you know, this is what partly engaged with anticipation looks like and having some agreed thing around that. It isn't that at all. It's to promote discussion that helps us know what to do next with individual children. So we talked quite a lot about that. That seemed to be the most important thing to everyone.
Thank you.
I think that's quite a key a key point actually, Kylie, about discussion, because it really does bring teams together, especially if you've got some video to show as well in your team meetings. You know, you get that piece of video up, and it really does bring out that discussion of that one pupil that you're trying to re-engage or move them up to where they're fully engaged. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if Julia or Lydia are still on. Lydia, I can see. I don't know if you wanted to add anything from your group, or Emma or Margaret.
I think, like somebody else said, it was really good to network within our group. And we were talking about the curriculum. Again, from the presentation, you know, it was really useful to kind of think, you know, the engagement model could be used not just with our PMLD students, but with other students in school. So we were thinking about our different cohorts and how we could use it in terms of PSHE, SRE, and how things can be delivered. So, you know, I don't want to repeat points, but yeah, it was useful. No,
that's fine. Thank you.
Alan,
well, look,
sorry, Alan, I'm just going to come in there. Well, as part of the engagement model training, there is a performer where you can rag rate your curriculum. I don't know if it's a really useful document that's been devised by the DFE, and it's just, I mean, we did it as special school anyway, but I'm trying to use that with mainstream settings, and they found it really useful. Which I'm quite happy to share if people want it. Sorry, Alan.
No, that's thanks. Well, maybe we can include that in the resource pack that we send out in the follow-up. Thank you. Does anybody else want to throw their hat into the ring and say something? If not, I'll bring things to a close. Yeah, sure, Patrick. Oh, sorry. Jane, I definitely would love to hear from you. So we'll just hear from Patrick first, and then.
No, I'm just waving goodbye. That's all.
Oh, right.
So,
can't win.
It's fantastic. No, it's fantastic. Though. Thank you very much.
No, lovely. Thank you, Patrick. Jane, please. Yeah, over to you. I was going to ask if you had any comments all the way from New Zealand.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's really lovely to have had some conversations with a small group. There were just 3 of us in the end, Emile and Catherine and I. But from, I suppose, right back from the beginning, and Bev and I were on the journey, as I say, 11 years ago. It's wonderful now to see the breadth of opportunity for young learners, be it, you know, here in the Antipodes or back in the UK. And I think the really rich part now too is the fact that ECMH is being folded in, and I think the fact too that people are not feeling that we have to be so rigid in looking at we are looking at targets, but more importantly, we're looking at the interactions and the reactions of our young people, regardless of what age stage they're at or what complexity they have, because they all bring their uniqueness. And I think through engagement for learning right at the outset, I think that was the richness that it's brought. And now, of course, with the evidence for learning as well and SCMH, I think it's giving us a wonderful holistic opportunity to actually see these young learners in so many through different lenses, as it were, as we're now saying. So it's just been wonderful to hear the input from people now as they joining and being able to go with their schools and their pupils to enable a richer form of learning and uptake.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. That's really good of you, and nice to see you. And thanks for flying the flag in NZ.
Well, it's great. And just for those of you, just a brief context, I'm head of school for National School for the Blind here in New Zealand, and we, as I say, have a very small cohort of young people at our base school, but they are very complex. So I must say, for me now, it's a wonderful challenge to now, 11 years on, be now bringing this to my own staff team here to, ironically, in a school for vision impaired, get them to look through different lenses with our young people.
Great. No, thank you, Jane. So what is it, 4:30 in the morning there or something?
It's about that, yes.
Yeah, crikey, you're a real trooper. Thank you. Thanks for contributing today and being part of it. Well, look, I don't want to put anybody else on the spot. So if there are any further comments, I'll leave a short pause, and if not, I'll wrap up. So speak now or forever hold your peace. Yay, we can go home. Well, look, thank you to everybody. I've thanked the speakers. I just would like to thank you all again, because I think there's real power in this community. I apologize about some of the technology hiccups. I'll do a crash course on Udemy to learn a bit more about PowerPoint and be better prepared for the next one. I just can't wait for the times when we can actually do face-to-face meetings again. Hopefully they're not too far away. We won't obviously expect everyone to fly over from New Zealand or wherever they might be, but we'll come to you and we'll set up regional meetings and we'll get dialogue going. So thank you very much. I hope you have a restful spring break. We'll be around over that time. So if you do foolishly find yourselves working and you need anything from Blake or myself or the rest of the EfL team, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're really looking forward to working with you in supporting you next term and beyond. So thank you very much again, everybody. Talk to you soon. See you.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.